Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thank you again for finding the time. I know this was a bit of a last-minute change we had to make because the Man Seder was supposed to be actually tonight, and then it got pushed off to Thursday, which meant I had to swap my shear to tonight instead.
I
And also,
may have to leave the class a little early because it turns out I had a meeting conflict. I didn't realize.
okay,
So
I'm
I'm
actually
going late to the meeting. I'm going to leave a little early from the class.
You're right. Okay, so that's good to know. And personally, just on my end, I don't know if I'm going to if we're going to go the full hour. We might actually some of you might prefer this. We might move a little bit faster.
Oh.
So I'm going to ask in general, just for tonight, if there are any clarification questions that you have, please by all means ask. I want to make sure the material is clear. But I'm because of the effects, I'm already getting like some sort of headaches and nausea. So you'll forgive me. I don't know if it's the best night to entertain additional questions. So if you're following with us, we are on Zion Amid Aleph. We are on 7a. And this is actually a very momentous occasion for us because, God willing, we are about to finish the first chapter of Makkos. And if you look in the chat, Jeremy was kind enough to share the Sefaria link. So if you're not following inside your own personal Gemara, you can click on the link that Jeremy just shared, and you can follow along on Sefaria. So again, we are 7a, Zion Amid Aleph, and we are at the Mishnah on the top. So that should be easy to identify. We are at the Mishnah at the top, and this is actually it's a relatively famous Mishnah. You'll see what I say. And now again, I know they tell you in rabbinical school you're not supposed to call things famous because to the guy who never heard it, they're like, what do you mean it was famous? It's like condescending. But I'm sure, I would doubt if you listen to a rabbi's sermon on a regular Shabbos, at some point, this has to have been quoted. So let's take a look. We're looking in the Mishnah, the final Mishnah in chapter 1 out of 3 in Makkos. And here we speak a little bit to the philosophy of a Beis Din. We've been talking so much about death penalties, Malchus, but do we actually have a sense of how frequently Beis Din wanted to give these death penalties? Now you get a sense, Jeremy, I know you always like pointing out that, especially in the previous classes, we learned that it's very hard to put somebody to death. We might put them in a kippah, we might put them incarcerate them till they die, but to actually give someone bona fide capital punishment, remember, you need the witnesses lined up, you need the hasra, it needs to be done deliberately. There's a lot of conditions. So how often do we think it occurs? Well, the Mishnah will tell us in this Mishnah, but before we get there, we're actually going to revisit a principle that we actually are already familiar with. So again, Mishnah on 7a. Misha Nigmar Dino Ubarach. Remember, we learned about this much earlier on in one of our first classes. If somebody in court A gets a verdict for a death penalty, Ubal Ibn Basin, so he escapes, right? He moves from Eilat, he moves all the way up to Akko. Ubal Ibn Oso Basin. But then what happens is he escapes and it winds up that the witnesses come before the same Beis Din. They manage to nab him. Ain Sosernis Dino. We don't go through the whole judicial process all over again. If the same Beis Din is able to nab him and bring him back into court, we're not going to go through all the proceedings all over again because this Beis Din has already reviewed the merits and disproofs to why this person is guilty of capital punishment. So that seems very reasonable. However, the Gemara will address that there's a seeming contradiction in the Mishnah. If you don't pick up on it now, I'll explain when we get to the Gemara. Kol makom sheyamdu shnayim v'yomer ma'idim anu b'ish ploni shenigmar dina b'beis din shel ploni uploni edav hareza yaharig. So in any place, if two witnesses come into Beis Din and they say, Ruvain, he was convicted in another Beis Din for and he's guilty and he should incur capital punishment. He escaped from that Beis Din and he's on the loose. So you guys should put him to death. And they give him all the information. They tell him which Beis Din it was, who the witnesses were, and they corroborate all the details. So then the other Beis Din is able to put him to death. Now, the contradiction, I'll mention it now, we'll resolve it in the Gemara, is that the first statement of the Mishnah makes it sound like, no, only when you go back to the first court do they not have to go through all the proceedings again. But in the second statement here, it sounds like any court they could go to, and they're not going to redo the proceedings. They'll just listen to what the witnesses say when they come in. So that's the first part over there. That's the first part of the Mishnah. And then we'll see this next thing is actually related to, we say, Sanhedrin nohagis ba'aretz u'b'chutz ha'aretz. So there was a Sanhedrin, like the Supreme Court. It comprised of 71 dayanim, 71 judges. That was the one that sat in the Lishkas Hagazis. That's the one that sat on the Temple Mount. But there were other satellite Sanhedrins, which were comprised of 23 dayanim. And so these satellite courts, they also can deal with capital cases. They can deal with corporal cases. So they don't need to be 71, but 23 is the minimum. We'll talk about that also in the Gemara. Now, here's the latter part of the Mishnah, which is iconic. Sanhedrin ha'oreges echa b'shavua nikris chovlanis. That a Sanhedrin that kills once every 7 years is branded a chovlanis. They are known to be a violent beis din. I'm assuming it's from the lashon of chovel, right? I'm curious, how does the article translate? It translates as violent, something like that? I'm just curious what word they use.
Place. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Destroyer. It says
destroyer, violent. Right, exactly. Like chovel es chavero.
Yeah. So
it says, now that's interesting. So if a beis din puts someone to death more than once every 7 years, that's considered radical for a beis din. But Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Omer, not just that, but actually echad l'shivim shana, once every 70 years. He added a 0 after the 7. Once every 70 years is the frequency. And then Rabbi Tar from Rabbi Akiva Omer, you know what? We could even one up you guys. Ilu hayinu b'Sanhedrin, if we were on that Sanhedrin, lo nerag adam me'olam, we would never put anybody to death. And now, we're sitting down right now saying they would never put anybody to death. Now, that seems like a very disturbing notion. And if you were thinking that, well, you're in good company, because Rav Shimon Gamliel responds, Afhein marbin shovchei dam Yisrael. You think you're doing the Jewish people a favor by minimizing capital punishment, but by you claiming that you're never going to mete out capital punishment, you're basically removing a deterrent, and you're essentially welcoming and almost encouraging people to commit acts that would incur capital punishment. You're basically encouraging people to commit murder because they know that nothing will happen. There will not be justice. And so that's Rav Shimon Gamliel's response. And again, this also will be elaborated on in the Gemara. So let me just take a moment over here to pause. Do you have any questions that we could address on the Mishnah?
One little thing, notice that Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, he's the one in the Seder who says, it was like if I had been 70, an old 70-year-old man.
Yeah.
Wonder if his favorite number is 70 or something.
Right. That's very good. That's a good connection right there. I remember seeing somewhere someone made that connection and it made a whole Dvar Torah out of it, but I don't remember exactly what the moral of that Dvar Torah was. But that's a very astute observation over there, and there's our connection to Pesach. Okay, so there's always a relevant connection.
Is it 70 years?
Shana.
Is it Shivim Shana Zikna? Is it?
He says Harini Kiben Shivim Shana. So he says I'm like 70 years old because he was appointed as one of the important rabbis, and then they realized, oh, he's a young guy. So you know what he did? He just grew a beard overnight. God caused that whole miracle to happen. And once you have a beard, apparently then you're rabbinic, and then people respect you.
Yeah.
I only went halfway. Okay. So Lifnei Osa beis din, let's go further. Let's take a look in the Gemara. So the first part of the Mishnah we're going to pick apart right now. Lifnei Osa beis din hu de'ein sosrin, halifnei beis din acher sosrin. The implication in the first line of the Mishnah is that the key word is Lifnei Oso beis din. If this guy who escaped beis din is brought before the same court, they don't redo his case. they immediately sentence him like they intended. But the implication is that if they bring him before another Beis Din that never reviewed his case, that even if witnesses say he was actually charged already in a previous court, he's convicted, the second Beis Din, the new Beis Din, would have to go through the proceedings all over again. That's the implication of the first statement in the Mishnah. But the second statement contradicts it, because Hatani Seifa, Kol makom sheyamdu shnayim, v'yamru ma'idin anu es ish ploni, shenigmar dino bebeis din ploni uploni edav hareza nerag. But the next part of the Mishnah says, Kol makom, any place, any court that witnesses come into, and they say that this guy was convicted elsewhere and requires capital punishment, then they don't redo the proceedings. They put him to death also once they've
No, but they are asking about the witnesses. That's an important difference. When you're in front of the same court, they're not asking anything. All you have to do is say, I know he was convicted in that court, period. No, you don't even have to say anything. They know it's that same court, so they know he was convicted there. But in the second situation, the witnesses have to say who the witnesses were in the first court, so that if there's some issue, they can deal with it. So it's not the same.
Well, the issue is the implication in the second case is that, right? I think we have to define also what it means, the first Beis Din, second Beis Din. It's unclear if when we say Beis Din, we mean the Beis Din as the 23 rabbis sitting on it, or we mean it as an institution. So it could be possible that the Beis Din in Modi'in was comprised of a number, 23 rabbis at one point. They all got their golden parachutes. They all retired, and now they're living in the Hamptons or in Florida, wherever they go. And there's a new pair of rabbis there. So when we say the same Beis Din, it's a little unclear. Do we mean the actual Beis Din institution, or are we referring to those people? If it's different people, it's very clear that we would need new witnesses to actually inform them that, by the way, your predecessors convicted this person. But your point's well taken, right? Why would they need the witnesses otherwise? But the contradiction would seem to stand that the first statement limits it only to the first Beis Din. The second statement says any Beis Din will not have to redo the proceedings to convict him. Once they know the witnesses are authentic, they base everything on their testimony, and they'll put someone to death based on that. So how do we resolve this seeming contradiction between these two statements in the Mishnah? So Amar Abai, our good friend Abai, says, Lo kasha, kam be'eretz Yisrael, kam b'chutz la'aretz. By the way, this is a great Gemara for those of us who are especially, I see Henry smiling already. You know what I'm going to say. For those of us who are like big AIPAC supporters here and big Zionists, this is your Gemara right here today. So you're going to be thrilled. I guess Yom HaTzmaut is right after Pesach, so that's what we have in mind also. Amar Abai, Lo kasha, kam be'eretz Yisrael, kam b'chutz la'aretz. The distinction is one statement in the Mishnah is referring to when someone escapes to Eretz Yisrael, to Israel, versus someone who flees Israel to the diaspora. And let's explain what that means based on a brisa, the Tanya. Rabbi Huda ben Dostai Omer, Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach, Barach me Eretz l'chutz la'aretz, ein sosun es dino. If somebody flees from Israel to the diaspora, then we do not throw out the original verdict, but rather, if two witnesses come in, they tell us that he was convicted in Israel, then he's put to death in the diaspora. But however, michutz la'aretz soser nes dino. However, if he's fleeing from diaspora and he fled, he's like, I don't trust the Batei Dinim in America. I didn't go to the Base of America lecture that Agudas Shalom hosted, so I didn't know that they were really that important. So instead, I made Aliyah, I fled to Israel. So there, soser nes dino, they actually in Israel, they will redo the entire proceeding, even if witnesses say that he was previously convicted in America. And why? Because of the merit of the land of Israel. Because we could play different ways. Maybe the standards in Israel are higher, whatever it might be. But just from a very plain reading of the Gemara, you come out basically saying, I think there might even be some Hasidic Torah on this. the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is so holy that we're willing to give this guy a second chance once he
It's like
flees
a cop-out answer.
there. Common answer. You
Yeah,
apparently,
because it
Phyllis,
could,
you
it could have
don't
been,
appreciate the significance of
No,
Israel.
the-
No, I'm kidding.
well, could be that the judges, or they don't trust the judges, or they don't trust the witnesses, or, you know.
Well,
No,
the
it's that he
the
would get
footnotes that I'm
extra-
reading.
extra
in
boost,
my
extra,
copy,
he'd get like extra merit for the fact that he was in Israel. That's what Rashi says.
Yeah, exactly. In the Rashi over there. Exactly. Ulai tol limsolo pesach shel schus. That's what Rashi says. Which I don't know. Maybe it's the Batei Dinim in Eretz Yisrael are more trained. They're more learned.
Yeah,
So maybe
that's
they
what I
could
think, yeah.
do
But
proceedings
the one
better
that-
than those in Chutzlar.
Yes,
Moshe,
Yes.
the footnotes that I'm reading talk about him perhaps having more merits as an individual in Eretz Israel than he does outside. And
Right.
those would come to save him in a base in Israel where they weren't available to him outside of Israel.
So Zay, thank you for bringing up that footnote, but it leaves certain elements unanswered, which is, we assume that when based in, we have a number of lawyers on over here. We assume that when you run through a case, you review the evidence, you review the arguments, and you try to make as close to an objective decision as possible based on the arguments and evidence that you have in front of you. So it's a little bit of a funny concept that we think all of a sudden, because he moves to Israel, somehow the factors in the equation are going to shift based on that. It means that there's maybe more subjectivity to this case than we would like, but a little unclear. I tried briefly looking at some commentaries. I didn't find anything that really I found satisfactory for it. But there you go. There's your Dvar Torah for Yom
The
Ha'atzmaut.
two completely different legal systems that we're talking about.
Right.
And they just come at it from completely different perspectives.
Who knows, right? Zay, so maybe in Diaspora they're operating off the Talmud Bavli. In Israel they're operating off the Talmud Yerushalmi. Maybe there were some important distinctions over there. Though this is the Bavli telling us that, but even the Bavli showed preference to Israel.
What I had in mind is that we in America are used to the American legal system, which stems from British common law, and this is just a completely different approach to a legal system.
Yeah, it is fascinating. It definitely is.
I don't know if this is correct, that maybe the lawyers will tell me, but someone once said to me, the difference between American law and Jewish law is that American law seeks justice and Jewish law seeks the truth.
It sounds like a good one-liner that a
Yeah.
speaker said at one point. It's a
But
little hard to summarize.
No, with somebody who knows.
But I would look at this. I'm looking at it in Safaria. I'm looking at the English, but when it's speaking about due to the merits of Eretz Yisrael, the court, maybe will discover a reason to exonerate him. I think it's almost talking about, I'm assuming that if there's a Beis Din in the diaspora, a Beis Din in Eretz Yisrael, the system it's the same system. It's just the way that it's administered. And so the merits of Eretz Yisrael, so there's something about the sensibility of being in Eretz Yisrael and the people who are in the Beis Din in Eretz Yisrael, that is the merit. It's the holiness of the place that maybe they could discover a reason to exonerate this person, whereas outside of Israel, the holiness is not the same. And so it's going to be perhaps less compassionate or whatever else it might be.
So that's all right. So Jeremy, your point's well taken about the sanctity of the land of Israel. Though I would suggest something different, which actually fits very well into the halachos we're about to talk about. The other way to understand is, I don't think I saw this in any of the commentaries, but it makes sense to me at least, that the legitimacy of the courts operating in the diaspora derive from the fact that there is a Sanhedrin that resides on the Temple Mount. Once that Sanhedrin was disbanded, capital cases were no longer administered, they're no longer dealt with, and since the Batei Dinim, the courts outside of in the diaspora, derive their legitimacy from the courts in Israel. Perhaps it's almost a way of deferring to, meaning if the legal system in Israel is the source, then it seems almost subversive to that for a diaspora court to make a ruling that binds in Eretz Yisrael court to its will. That's a suggestion that I'm thinking of, and you'll see this dynamic in the Gemara momentarily. Okay, so let's go forward. Sanhedris no Haggis. So we said that there are, like we just mentioned, the Mishnah tells us that there were Sanhedrins that operated in Israel, and there were Sanhedrins that operated in a diaspora. What is the distinction between Israel and a diaspora? So, Minahani Mili, the Tanurabanan, Vahayu Ela Lachem Lechukas Mishpat Ledoro Seichem, and add in Bechol Moshvo Seichem. The Gemara actually doesn't have the rest of the pasuk, but the Gilyon here adds in these two words because that's important. Bechol Moshvo Seichem, you should have them in all of your dwelling places. You should have judges in all of your dwelling places. Lamanu Sanhedrin Haggis Ba'ars B'chutzars. So B'chol Moshvo Seichem, we don't only live in Israel. There are Jews who live in a diaspora as well. I'm pretty sure that's all of us over here. So there is an imperative and a law that we have to set up Sanhedrins outside the land of Israel as well, because it has to be in wherever you may find yourself dwelling. But im matam lomar bisharecha. Then why does it say in your gates in the verse? That might seem to limit things more to Israel. So what's the message there? Bisharecha atamoshe bati dinim chol pelach pelach ir v'ir. So in Israel, there is more of an imperative. Not only do you set up batei dinim, do you set up courts in every province, but you also set them up in each and every city. Whereas in the diaspora, you need to have general satellite batei dinim, but you don't get the same convenience of living in Israel. Instead of having to set up a Sanhedrin in each and every city, rather one per province suffices. So that is a distinction between Israel and between diaspora. And again, this goal like tie into your Yom Ha'atzmaut drasha, talking about why Israel is much better than everything else. Okay, next part. Now this deals with the final part of the Mishnah, which I think this part of the Gemara, obviously all the Gemara is fascinating, but I found this one to be the most fascinating part of the Amud that I was looking at, and you'll let me know if you agree. So Sanhedrin Ha'oregis, remember we said a Sanhedrin that kills once every 7 years, once every 70 years, a little unclear, or maybe never at all. A Sanhedrin should never kill at all. So how frequently is Sanhedrin expected to administer the death penalty? So right before we get to the very intriguing part, Yibailahu, when he said once every 70 years as a response, did he mean that also if you do once every 70 years, you too are called a chavlanis? That's called a violent bastin. Odilma orach arhi, or maybe he's saying no, rather once every 70 years is the norm, that we expect once every 70 years there will be a death penalty administered. So a little unclear, it's a little vague. So teku, the Gemara leaves it unresolved. Now, remember how we said the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva omrim ilu hayinu b'Sanhedrin, if we were on that Sanhedrin, we would never put anybody to death. And to which Rabbi Shimon Gamliel responded saying, are you crazy? What do you mean? You're basically just inviting people to murder. You're basically just declaring a 24/7 year-long purge that you can kill whoever you want and there'll be no consequences for it. Right? Anyone ever? I saw like part of a movie once, I think on a plane. There's this whole movie called The Purge that they said one night a week, one night a year. They just, all bets are off. The law doesn't apply. You can kill whoever you want. It's like a very dystopian concept. There's a movie that came out a few years ago. So, right, imagine basically what Rakim and Tarfon are doing is they are instituting a de facto purge all year long because I can run around murdering whoever I want and you'll never put me to death on that. Now, again, remember, you can be put in the kippah still. You can still be incarcerated until you die. So that's not such a lovely ending either. Okay, but the question is, from a legal, technical standpoint, how did they actually make sure to not put someone to death ever? How they figured it out? So what kind of questions did they ask? This is fascinating. Hey, Kahavu Avdi, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Dami Tervayu. So when they came in and they heard that testimony that Reuven killed Shimon, they would ask questions like, Re'isim Treifa, Re'isim Treifa Harag, Shalim Harag. Was the person who was killed, was he a Treifa or was he a Shalim? So similar to in kashrus laws, it's the same idea. A Treifa is someone who is going to die in less than a year because he has maybe a hole in one of his organs, he has some sort of organ failure, and essentially it's clear that he's not going to last the year. So the halacha is that if someone kills a treifa, that's a terrible thing, but it's not the same as killing someone who's healthy, because this person is considered a gavra ketela. He's already someone who has very little time left. So rather than you taking away someone's life who have many years ahead of them, you're taking away someone who has very limited quantified time left. So it's not the same thing. You wouldn't be put to death for killing the treifa. So they'll ask. Sorry, just a moment. Let me just finish this. So the question over here is, So the point that they're making here is that they would ask, how do you know that when Reuben killed Shimon, that Shimon the victim was not a treifa? And Amar Ravashi, Intim Salomar Shalim Hava, and even if somehow you were privy to that information and you knew this guy was healthy and had no medical issues at all, perfect record, Dilma, the Makkos Saif Nakav Hava, maybe where the puncture from the sword pierced him, that's where the hole was in his organ that he was going to die from. So even if you inspect the body afterwards, you perform, again, whether you're allowed permitted to do an autopsy, what circumstances, that's a whole separate shear. But imagine, so if you did an autopsy and you see that there's a pierce wound and everything else looks fine, how do you know that where he was pierced, maybe there was already a hole over there? So the murderer may have just been killing, again, a treifa. And because this is information which is virtually impossible to discover and corroborate or quantify, therefore, every potential murderer would be let off the hook, because even though we are 99.99% sure they killed someone who would make them incur the death penalty, since there's that little slight sort of shadow of a doubt, therefore they would not put them to death. And by the way, not just in cases of murder, in cases of illicit sexual acts as well. Also, what kind of questions would they ask? If some, let's say they were testifying that Reuven and Rivka committed adultery. So what kind of questions would the basin ask them in order so that they wouldn't put the adulterer and adulteress to death? So they would ask, that's a euphemism. A michel b'shufer is kind of like, I think, like a tube and an eyeliner. So, I mean, obviously I don't use this myself, but I'm pretty sure, right? So when women want to put on makeup on their eyes or eyelash, I don't know what these things are. I don't know what it's called. It's like eyelash makeup.
Yeah, it's called a tube. Applicator. Yeah, those are the right words.
Yeah, that's it. Right. So an applicator and a tube, which of course is a mashal, is a euphemism for the explicit sexual act. So they would ask, did you see kemichachol b'shifoferes? Did you see literally the insertion of his genitalia into hers? And it's very hard to actually see that precisely. I mean, especially, once they notice that they're being watched, they're probably going to disengage as well, I would imagine. So that's something also which is almost virtually impossible for the witnesses to testify that they saw precisely, that they can verify that they actually committed the sexual act together. And that's how Rabbi Akiva Tarfon would get the adulterer and adulteress off the hook from capital punishment. Now, the question is, hey, that's a good point, actually. According to everyone else, how do we ever put an adulterer and adulteress to death if we can't get solid 100% proof that they weren't just committing things that are avisrayu to arayos, things that come close to a sexual act, but the actual act itself. So Rabbanan hechi dayenu kishmuel to Amar Shmuel v'na'afim mishayoruk v'na'afim. So Shmuel says you don't actually have to see the penetration, the precise sexual act, but instead it's enough for you to see that they are acting in a sexual way with each other. And if the witnesses see that much, then we presume they committed the sexual act as well. And on that basis, they can be put to death. And that would be what the majority opinion is of the Chachamim based on Shmuel's statement. And with that, Hadronolach Ketzad Ha'edim, we have just concluded our first chapter of Makkos. So, Mazel Tov, take out a little bit of
Yay.
some Lagavulin. So I just want to
Yeshkoach, everyone. Yeshkoach, Rabbi.
Yes, and thank you. And so this is I'm
gonna run to my meeting now. Bye, everybody. Mazel Tov.
Yep.
Okay, Mazel Tov.
Good night.
So those who do
Thank
have
you
some
so much.
time, we actually will go into the next Mishnah. It's very important when we finish something, we have to make a haskalah. We have to make, frankly, also because we haven't finished Yom as well. We finished a chapter, but we haven't finished Yom. We're almost done. But this is a very momentous occasion. I feel bad almost that, here I am half sick and we moved it to a different date where we don't have as many people. But thank you again for everyone for making it this week so that we could celebrate this momentous occasion together. And Jeremy, it looks like you got something over there. Oh, very. You want to pass it around?
How old is it?
How old is it? It is
20 years?
no, it's not saying how old it is.
Huh.
Okay.
It's Clemens, though. You have to finish it in just a few days here.
It's
Yeah.
it'll get finished. It's a single batch bourbon.
Okay,
Fine.
great.
Enjoy.
Let's okay, so one thing I want to share briefly before we go into next parak is the share of Tosfos, the last Tosfos in the parak as well. So those who are following inside, you can look at on the left side, Dibor Maskil Kemichol B'Shifo Feres. So the Gemara asks Tosfos asks as follows: Tema Oved Avodah Zara Umechal Shabbos Ma'ik Leneimar Tasam Lo Matzila Miftarei. So all the questions we suggested in the Gemara for how someone can never be put to death, that works in the case of murder. It works in the case of a sexual intercourse, illicit sexual intercourse. But in a case where somebody is being convicted for violating Shabbos, or someone's being convicted for committing idolatry, it's not so hard for the witnesses to confirm that the guy was, bowing down to the Asherah tree. It's not so difficult for them to see that somebody was chopping down trees on Shabbos, as Makoshi Sheitzim. So how did Rabbi Akiva Tarfon make sure that they wouldn't put all these other people to death where they couldn't use as creative and precise questions to get the potential defendant out of capital punishment? So there are two answers Tosfos gives. Number one, the Shlomar de Mikol Malkum Kamar Shaper Lo Haya Adam Nera Mishum Lo Shchichi Kulehai Kimber Seif Arayos. So one is that just these cases, the cases that always came before Beis Din of potential capital punishment, were always cases of either murder or sexual immorality. But you didn't have people coming in on a regular basis with cases of Ploni committed idolatry or Ploni was violating Shabbos. Apparently, those were not such common sins, right? They were people who were murdering and committing adultery right and left, but apparently they were holy enough not to be breaking Shabbos. And I'm not sure how they pick one and not the other, but don't ask me. That's what Tosfos suggests. But perhaps some of us might be doubtful of this premise of this Metzias. So presumably, if there's people who are committing arayos right and left and murdering people, chances are Hilchos Shabbos isn't on the top of their priorities either. So that leads us to perhaps another answer in Tosos. Tosos says, "Va'odi shlomar, de'ika lememar." Basin can ask them, "Re'isim shemechalel eno treifa, dimhu treifa imkeim tizman lo yechayavin misa mishum dematzal lememar gavra ketel be'inu lemikdal v'havale idashiato yochla azima." Okay, so follow this. Remember in the Gemara, when we brought in the concept of treifa, someone's going to die within 12 years. So we said, how would the defendant get off the hook? By categorizing the victim as a treifa. What Tosas is saying, though, when it comes to Shabbos, how did Raikiv and Raitarfon get them out of it? What they would say is, maybe the case is where the person committing it is a treifa, meaning how do we know the person who's being mechalel Shabbos, the person who's violating Shabbos, or the person who's committing idolatry, maybe he's a treifa. Now, what's the issue, right? You know, if I'm a treifa and I commit one of these capital crimes, shouldn't I also be put to death all the same? That is true. But the issue is, we learned this a long time ago, I think maybe in our first class. There's a principle called edus shiata yochel azima. Any testimony, in order for it to be admissible in Beis Din, there needs to be the potential for the witnesses to become Edom Zomamin, for them to become convicted as Edom Zomin and to thereby be punished. And if witnesses cannot be found guilty of Hazama, then their testimony is not admissible in Beis Din. So here we go. The witnesses, they want to put this treifa to death. The issue is that they're not going to wind up with the same kind of punishment for trying to put a treifa to death. So if he's a treifa, he was only going to get a treifa death. They are going to get actual bona fide capital punishment. They have their lives ahead of them. And so because they can't get a stronger punishment than that which they wanted to mete out to the defendant that they falsely accused, so therefore it should be either Shiata Lazima, because maybe he's a treifa. So they should never be able to put him to death. So basically what Rai Akiva Tarfon did was they turned all these cases into potential Eila Shiata Lazima, cases where maybe the defendant's a treifa. And if the defendant's a treifa, since we don't know, therefore there can never be testimony that's accepted against them. So that's the Tosis over there. A little complicated at the end, but a nice little tidbit. Anyway, what I want to do now is just basically get into the next Mishnah. There's a Mishnah right at the beginning of chapter 2, and it just goes right to the top of the next page. So this should go down pretty smoothly. Now, a term that I was taught, I think, Jeremy, maybe you're the one who told it to me, called negligent homicide. You'll tell me if it has a perfect parallel here. So we referenced it before. The reason this is brought up in the second chapter of Makkos is because you remember at the beginning of the first chapter, we learned that Edom Zomamin, who claimed that someone killed killed accidentally, he committed murder bishogeg. By the way, write that down. That's an important term. Bishogeg means inadvertent murder. So someone kills bishogeg inadvertently, then they are sent to Gullus. And right, we said that in Zoman, even though the defendant would have gone into exile, they don't have to go to exile. They get 39 lashes. That's what we learned all those many weeks ago. Now that we brought that up, the second chapter will be dedicated to talking about someone who murders inadvertently and what cases he goes to Gullus, what cases he gets put to death, what cases, he just let off the hook. So let's start. The main distinction that the Mishnah will mention at the end is that if I am doing downward movements and I accidentally kill someone, I get sent to Gullus. If I'm doing upward movements, my activity is pushing something up away from the victim, and somehow it still results in hitting him and killing him. That's so far-fetched, it's so distant from it even being my fault, that's nearly an ones. So just a few more terms. There's something called pshia, which is negligence. And on the other extreme, there's something called ones, which is a mishap beyond my control. So when I accidentally kill somebody, it might be due to negligence. And I could have somehow prevented it. But it wasn't It wasn't done maliciously. I didn't mean to murder him, but I could have been more careful. So therefore I get put into exile to atone for that sin. But I still don't get the treatment of an actual murderer. But if I accidentally kill somebody, it was so far-fetched, and I took the necessary safety precautions, then I'm not even sent to exile. It's a terrible deed. It's a terrible mishap that happened, but I'm not considered a murderer, not even an inadvertent murderer. And we'll see it in the Mishnah right now. Elohin Agolin, Hahorig Nefesh Bishgaga. So who gets sent into exile? Someone who murders someone inadvertently. What's the case? One case is you're working on a roof. You got one of these. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I always imagine it looks like kind of like that rolling pin that you use to make dough for challah. He's using some sort of device that he's pushing and rolling. You can look at Rashi on a roof, and then he pushes it down as a stroke, and it slips out and hits the guy on the ground and kills him. That's one case. The other case is, next case is Mishal Shablachavis Benafal Varkaso. I'm a construction guy, right? Imagine God forbid should happen in our shul, but right, imagine I'm working on the sanctuary right now with the stained glass, and I'm lowering down a bucket of some stained glass to get repaired, and hits the guy on the bottom. It just snaps. The rope snaps and hits the guy on the bottom in the middle. So that also is a case of inadvertent murder. Yore Basulam, or if I'm coming down the ladder during my construction project, Vanafal of Hargo, Hareze Gola, and I fall down from the ladder, and thankfully, fortunately for me, something broke my fall. Unfortunately for the guy on bottom of me, it was him, and it kills him. So then, in those cases, I could have been a little bit safer, but so it's considered killing b'shogeg, inadvertent murder. However, the opposite now of all those cases. What if I was pulling the magila, I was pulling that rolling pin up, or I was pulling up the bucket and then the rope snapped and it fell down. But my movement were upward movements away from the victim. Or I was going up the ladder and then fell down. Bahargo. I do not go to Galus. Why? Zahaklau kol shebederech ridaso golep. If I'm going in a downwards motion, I get sent to Galus. I go into exile. If it's not in a downward motion, i.e., presumably toward the victim, then I do not get sent to Galus. And the assumption is because that is more out of my control, then I should really be more careful. If I'm moving something hazardous in the direction of somebody, I really should be more careful. And therefore, it's more on me. Again, it's not deliberate. It's not malicious, but it was very negligent of me. And, was he wearing his hard hat? Was he not wearing his hard hat? I don't know. But it killed him anyway. So the Gemara next time here on Zion and Bays, we turn the page, will explain where we get this whole distinction of upwards versus downward motions, and we'll really sink our teeth into these sugyos. But I think we'll conclude over here, but let me just pause. Are there any questions that we have so far? A lot will be resolved about what we just learned right now, but anything that's sticking out currently?
Just wondering why they call the guy Treifa.
Similar to food, right? So I'm sure you're aware, when we call non-kosher food treif is only one way something becomes non-kosher. It just became a catch-all term. But a treifa is an animal also that its condition is that it's not going to live out the year. It's gonna die soon. We talked about, remember we talked about foie gras.
You're on veal, your veal and foie gras.
Yeah, exactly, Amber. Thank you.
I didn't
The veal and foie gras class.
Yeah. Well,
So Ramosha Feinstein pointed that out. That many of them
85% or treif or something.
Yeah, it depends on the shoftim. Like someone said, maybe 40% will not be treifos. Maybe 40, according to the shoftim hamakilim. So that's good memory, Henry. Very good.
I just thought a person would be referred to with some other wording rather than the same as an animal.
Well,
about foie gras, and there is a farm in New York State where they able to identify a bird and a method of feeding it that didn't include the force feeding, and they're able to get the foie gras perfectly
Oh.
kosher.
Right. So if you could avoid the force feeding, because the two issues were, one, that the way they treat them is that it might render them a treifa, and the second issue was sar balei chaim. But if they're treating them properly, then that might be able to circumvent both those issues. So I would assume it does. In our class on sar balei chaim that we did, I think it may have been like the second or third. I don't know. It was one of our earlier classes that we did, and then Henry, you heard it during Shalosh Shudas, so that way everyone got to hear it. All right. Again, I just want to emphasize
Thank you.
Huge Yasher Koach. I
Thank
wish we
you,
could get together
Rabbi.
and have a siyum, but you know what? God willing, when we're getting close to finishing the Masechta, we'll have to form a subcommittee over here to determine how we're going to make a siyum on it. But we're already 1 out of 3 chapters done, so a significant accomplishment. And again, thank you all for your commitment. And God willing, we'll pick it up next week again.
Hope you feel better.
Yes.
By the way, next week, in terms of being before Yontif, it's
B'dikas
B'dikas
Chametz.
Chametz Thursday night, right?
Let's see. What time is B'dikas Chametz? We might have to switch the time of this year anyway, because Mincha was 6:50 this week, and it's only going to get later. So at a certain point, it becomes impossible for Mincha. Ma'ariv will still be going on while this class starts, so we might have to push it off. I'm moving to suggestions, but let's think about that. Do we want to move it much earlier? Or do we want to just keep pushing off slightly later? So feel free to email me your thoughts. All right. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Yasher Koach and Mazel Tov.
Right.
Bye.
Feel